Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Whether you're a pastor, church leader, or a passionate member of your faith community, this podcast is designed to challenge, inspire, and equip you with the tools you need for impactful ministry. And now for a little bit about the guest for this episode.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, Loren Richmond Jr. is in conversation with Dr. Jeffrey Keuss. Jeff is an author, a professor of Christian ministry, theology, and culture, and the director of the University Scholars Program at Seattle Pacific University. In addition to his work at SPU, he is a visiting professor of practical theology at Fuller Theological Seminary Northwest and a regular contributor to the Kindling's Muse monthly podcast on theology and culture. His books include Defiant Hope, Active Love, and Your Neighbor's Hymnal, What Popular Music Teaches Us About Faith, Hope, and Love. A reminder, before we start today's conversation, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share Future Christian with a friend. Your engagement helps to ensure that these important conversations about navigating and resourcing the future of the church continue and reach more people.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. I am Loren Richmond Jr., and I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. Jeff Keuss. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the show. Anything else you'd like our listeners to know about you?
No, it's great to be with you, Loren, and looking forward to talking about our book and our research.
Yeah, absolutely. Share, if you would, just a little bit about your faith background, what that looked like in the past and what that looks like today.
Yeah, I grew up in a very moral, very ethical household, but it wasn't a Christian household. My parents were early 60s college dropouts who happened to move to Hawaii to live on the beach. Then I was born in Hawaii, lived in Pearl City outside of Honolulu, moved to Guam for a time when my parents started serving as some schools in the south end of Guam. And I grew up really questioning a lot of things. I was a kid who was very curious, had parents who were very interested in politics and in community building and in right and wrong. Ended up going to church when I was young with a next door neighbor. Went and started participating in Sunday school, learning stories. But then eventually, just kind of wandered into academics in high school, became kind of a nerd, did a lot of, my AP classes, started reading the I.D. Ching, started reading Carl Sagan, started reading, Buddhist texts, started reading Aristotle. It was kind of these nerdy high school kids, very involved in athletics as well. So team sports was a big part of my life. But then it was in my sophomore year in high school that I got involved in the ministry of Young Life, outreach evangelical ministry that I became a part of, and had this radical encounter with not just the idea of Jesus Christ, but the person of Jesus Christ, and saw the lived example of people who were thoughtful, intelligent, engaged, who were also followers of Jesus. And it didn't square because I kind of thought Christianity was for people who just didn't think, had this arrogant idea that Christianity was people who basically shut their minds off and were just kind of blindly following things. And that wasn't the story of the people I met. And so all the stereotypes kind of get thrown out the window. I went to the high school that Jimi Hendrix went to high school with, Bruce Lee went to my high school, Quincy Jones went to my high school, big inner city, predominantly black high school. So I was formed by Jimi Hendrix as much as anything else. And I had young life leaders who weren't scared of music, weren't scared of movies, weren't scared of big ideas, weren't scared of big books. And they deeply loved each other. And that transformative experience of being around thoughtful, intelligent, civil people who cared deeply about each other changed my life. So I became a Christian my junior year in high school and changed the trajectory of my life. And so Just to kind of fast forward, I'm an ordained Presbyterian minister. I've served a number of churches, both in Europe, predominantly in Scotland, the Church of Scotland, but then also here in the United States. I was a church planner at one point in the early 90s. Also served in big cathedrals. But I'm also an academic. I'm a theologian. I did my academic training at Fuller Theological Seminary. I got my MDiv there. Later, I was at Harvard, did my degree in industrial organizational psychology at Harvard, and also did my PhD in theology in the arts at University of Glasgow in Scotland, where I served on the faculty of divinity there for almost 6 years. Teaching in practical theology as well as ethics. I'm now a theologian at Seattle Pacific University in Seattle, which is a Methodist university. We're broadly ecumenical. And have been teaching students in undergraduate and graduate programs, both in the School of Theology as well as in industrial organizational psychology for quite a while. So I kind of bridge a number of disciplines. I teach and do research in the arts, predominantly in literature, kind of, how ideas come out in fiction. I did my PhD actually on the Victorian novelist George Eliot and kind of the early 19th century views of Christianity in the arts. And I've continued that work, doing a lot of work in research on the arts as well. Do a lot of work on organizational structures and leadership development over in the IO psychology department. And I'm also somebody who's very, very passionate about religion across the disciplines. I teach a lot of classes that kind of connect disciplinary liberal arts ideas around the person of Christ. And some of the book and the research that I do in the book that we'll be talking about today, is framed by a 10-year longitudinal grant that I received from the Lilly Endowment. I'm the principal investigator, the PI for this big grant, where we're studying young adults, asking 22 to 29-year-olds, what are they interested in? Where do they want to have conversations of meaning and depth? And in some ways, it's kind of a reflection of what I talked about in my own faith journey. I want to know we're thinking, thoughtful, engaged people who are not scared of really, really hard questions. I like to say the kinds of questions we don't talk about around the Thanksgiving table because Uncle Bob will get mad or Aunt Jenny will walk away in a fuming rage. So we keep those conversations tamped down. But if you're 25 years old, you don't want to keep those questions tamped down. Yeah. You want to have actual real conversations and not just behind the house or in the kitchen where it's safe to have those conversations, but you want to have them at the table. Which means that they want churches to have real conversations about real things, and not just overly abstract ideas, but actually have them very gritty, very grounded, and very meaningful. So the first 5.5 years of this grant work, I spent a lot of time in taverns, in pubs, in CrossFit gyms, in Zumba classes, at climbing groups, in places of work, sitting in basements, sitting in people's apartments with Yeti coolers filled with White Claw with a bunch of young adults, just chopping it up. It's like, hey, what are you looking for? What is meaning? What happens to you? One of the first questions we've asked for 5 years. I mean, it's a long time to be asking the same question, but the first question we always started with is, what is faithfulness to you? What does it mean to be faithful? And we ask that question repeatedly of church leaders. We ask that question repeatedly of young adults. And what we found is the question of faithfulness is a really great place to start. What are you faithful to? And why are you faithful to? It's a very Augustinian question. We are what we love. And what we give our hearts to love, we get changed and formed by that thing. So we need to be very picky about the things that we love and allow to love us. As human beings, we're more malleable than I think we realize. We get framed by the things and the ideas that we give ourselves to. And so faithfulness is a very real question. And the fear for many young adults, and we can get into this more deeply as we get into some of the questions in the book, is how churches want to distract us from the things that may sometimes form us to be closer to Christ. So this is one of the things we found in the book, and one of the things that we're really hoping to get out to church leaders, get out to young adults, get out to places of work even, because this became a really big conversation point that a lot of young adults are framed as much by their work as anything else. So we need to take seriously what people do in their work and learn how to talk about it. And that's a little bit about my faith journey and kind of led us up to this book, but I'm happy to get a little deeper into that. I know that was a little bit of a long road, but that's what you get when you interview a guy who's old.
Well, let's just jump right in then, because you've kind of introduced the background of the book, that it's,
Sure.
if I'm understanding correctly, having a background in the Lilly grant, the long study. So what else do you want to say just about the book, broadly speaking, to introduce it?
Yeah. Just a little more background about the project. In 2016, the Lilly Endowment, which is a massive endowment formed by the Lilly family years ago. It's not Eli Lilly, but it's family members who have started a foundation after that. They brought together 12 researchers, and I was one of the 12. And we had a meeting in 2016, and they said, look, we're looking at the U.S. Census data, and we found that outside of baby boomers, which is the largest demographic age-wise in the country, the next largest group that's moving through are 22 to 29-year-olds. Okay, so this is back in 2016. So that's changed a little bit because of time. But this is the largest demographic in the United States, and they're the least likely demographic to be in a mosque, to be in a temple, to be in a synagogue, or to be in a church. So, just from a data point, that regression line is incredibly startling. When you have the largest population who is least likely to be inside a building, to participate in faith practices, and this is across religious traditions. This isn't merely just within Christianity and the big tent of Christianity, but this is, all religious traditions. And so their question to us was, why is that? What's going on? And you have some instincts usually that you think about with that, but they said, we want to get some granular data on that. So it didn't become $1 million question. It became a $55 million question for Lilly. Because we only had 5 years at first, but then we came back after 5 years. All the research centers across the country said, look, we need more time. This is a massive, massive study, and we're just beginning to scratch it. So we're in the second tiers, phase 2 of this project right now. So I hired a number of researchers, PhD students in IO psychology to start modeling surveys, and you'll see some of the survey data in the book, as well as theologians and myself to kind of manage the project work. And we just got on the road. Now my part of the project, which you'll see in the book, is focused primarily on the Pacific Northwest, so the I-5 corridor. So this is north to Canada, down through Washington State and Oregon, and then east over into Idaho. So our churches and our conversation partners primarily are in that 3-state region over the Pacific Northwest. But you'll see in the book that we compare our findings, both quantitative and qualitatively, with national data from our other partners. So we found that the trends that we're seeing are largely similar to what you're seeing across the country of what our findings are. So that's a little bit about the project.
Yeah, so I think what's interesting there, obviously being in the Pacific Northwest, if the rumors or the stereotype, holds true, right? You could say that
stereotypes can be the same thing.
Right. The Pacific Northwest is in many ways like, you could think like 5-10 years advance, right, of where the general culture is going. Is that fair?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that are, every region of the United States has its own unique character, right? That's what makes us such an interesting, diverse experiment as a country. And the Pacific Northwest is interesting for a number of things, both theologically as well as economically and socially. Theologically, the Pacific Northwest has no major church denomination headquarters based here. We are kind of a frontier area, right? So if you are Presbyterian, if you're Lutheran, if you're Catholic, if you're Baptist, people have come from another place and set up churches here, right? But the other thing about this region theologically is there's no one dominant, like majorly dominant Christian tradition, right? So if you're in Minnesota, you're either Lutheran or not Lutheran, right? If you are in parts of Texas, you're either Southern Baptist or not Southern Baptist, right? You have this dominant sense of Christian identity in certain parts of the country. Yeah. And you come out and you start slicing up the pie of kind of like how many Presbyterians are there, how many non-denominational evangelicals are there, how many Baptists there are out here in the Pacific Northwest. Each pie slice is so thin compared to everything else that nobody has a dominant voice. I mean, like Washington State, for example, probably has the biggest dominant voice, with about 21% of the population of Washington who would say they're Christian would be Roman Catholic, right? So Protestant traditions are just small slices, for example, along the way. So what that means is there's not like one big dominant voice telling you what Christians are or aren't. When you walk into Google, when you walk into Amazon, when you walk into Boeing, walk into Comcast, when you walk into Costco, these big, huge, employers, Microsoft, that are all out here, big tech places, big money. There's not a picture really of what a Christian is that's bubbling up from the sidewalk, right? You're not having a bunch of people saying, this is what the Bible is, this is what the Bible isn't. There is that, but it's coming through other means. So it's coming through generalized podcasts like this one. It's coming through literature. It's not coming through congregational life and formation. Economically, the other thing about the Pacific Northwest is, that also helps push on this theological question is we're an economic bubble. We have been all the way for the past 30 years with the tech boom that came up through in the 90s, with the way that in the early aughts, we had this explosion of growth in various tech industries. The Pacific Rim has brought in a lot of money as well as a port city, where a lot of the country after 2008 went through these big dips and drives as far as the housing crisis. All of that stuff didn't affect as nearly as harsh as it did in other parts of the country. The Pacific Northwest has had this expansion and growth for the past particularly 20 years, where it's been fairly safe economically to be here. And that's created a very weird kind of economic picture to the place as well. So that in itself has also been a challenge.
Yeah.
And lastly, I'll just say that another thing about our region that also shifts this is a lot of the country talks about the Pacific Northwest as this unchurched area, like the great unchurched Pacific Northwest, right? We have the least amount of churches per capita in Seattle, for example, in anywhere in the country. Right. Now that is true in the sense of like actual buildings and spaces for worship. But if you start pulling data as far as, do you believe in God? Are you a follower of Jesus Christ? Do you pray? We actually have a very, very high engagement with religion. And particularly evangelicalism, non-denominationalism is a really big story out here. You'll see a chapter in the book where we talk about the growth and the after effects of Mars Hill Church, which many people in evangelical circles have heard of. So we have kind of a frontier way that people come out here. They build a website. They're church planners, and they're not attached to any real theological traditions. So there's a lot of those stories that are out here too that kind of make that a very active and very vibrant place for Christians to talk and believe, but not really grounded in particular religious practices like spiritual disciplines that would come through being a Lutheran being catechized or a Roman Catholic being catechized. It's a lot more of the Wild West out here as far as how people form their Christianity.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the interesting things that you present in the book here that I wanted to talk about. Yeah. The common thinking is that these young adults aren't interested in religion, and you're wanting to change that narrative.
Yeah, one of the things that we found in our studies that I think just shocked pastors when we talk to pastors and priests and we bring our research out and we say, hey, we'd like to tell you something that you may not understand, is that young adults do not want to shut down churches. So by and large in our data, there's this picture, I think, from inside of churches, particularly in more evangelical churches, that, well, it's a culture war out there. 26-year-olds, they don't want to go to church. They want churches shut down. They want to turn our church into a skating rink, or they want to turn it into just a big rave club or something. All these kind of weird thoughts that they have about, they don't want us to even be around. And that's just not true. We asked a broad swath, thousands of young adults, both in the region and outside the region. We asked questions about, what do you think about churches? What do you want them to exist? Do you want them shut down and repurpose that money to help the poor? I mean, what are your thoughts on this? And they were like, oh, no, churches need to be there. Churches are agents of social change. Churches are places that, people can go for food banks. And these are people who are, conservative as well as progressive, who want churches to exist. They've seen the change that it's had in their parents. They may not agree with where their parents are. They may have very different theological views than their parents, but they saw that this is something their parents love, their grandparents love. So young adults are not broadly. I mean, you're going to get things on the either end of a
Right.
bell curve in any research.
Right.
So you certainly have ones on one end of the bell curve is like, oh yeah, churches are these repressive places and I don't want to go there. Well, these are just more reactionary statements.
Yeah,
But
the
the
ones making the noise.
broad number of young adults, 22 to 29-year-old, think churches need to exist. That they're vitally important to the social fabric of our country. They're part of what, and this was like such a shock to some pastors when we were starting to roll our research out that they didn't even know what to do with that because they'd been preaching a narrative from the pulpit that the people outside this door are against us.
Right.
And it's like, no. They're not against you at all. They actually would love to come and be part of what's happening here. But the on-ramp question, which is in the book, we talk about on-ramps and off-ramps.
Yeah, let's
may be
hold
different
off
than
on
you
that.
think it is. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's so interesting because I think whether, like you said, in evangelical circles, there's this idea that like young adults are antagonist to churches. Like for me, in a mainline context, I feel like I see it the other way where it's like, oh, young adults think church is irrelevant, doesn't matter, so why are we doing this?
Right.
One thing I wanted to talk about, though, to jump from that is you talk about this belong, believe, behave trifecta, and I see that most often in at least the belong, believe kind of emphasis in evangelical spaces.
Yep.
And I'm curious if you can talk more about what that is, what that means, and what that looks like in churches.
Yeah. There's kind of a message that I think some young adults get about what church life is. What does it mean to belong to a faith community? What does it mean to settle into a community where you're participating? And so one of the questions that we asked a lot of young adults is, what does it mean to be part of a church? So we were interviewing church leaders, and also young adults. What does it mean? How do you know that you're part of the church? And one of the things that came up a lot was, well, they keep asking us to join membership classes, right?
Yeah.
So there's this membership thing that happens, right? So it's like, in order for us to be part of the church, we should go to a membership class. And different churches have different ways of doing this. There's catechesis models, and different churches, more liturgical churches, have different kind of on-ramps to get part of the church. But even in evangelical churches, they've shortened the time frame. Say, hey, come to this weekend thing, and then you can become a member, right? But when we talk to young adults about what is membership,
already,
So when we talk to young adults about membership, we say, well, what does that mean to you? And they say, well, I don't really understand it because I'm a member of Costco. So I'm a Costco member, and
I'm a gym member.
Yeah, I belong to my CrossFit gym. I belong to I belong to Sam's Club or something like that. And I know what I get from it, and I know what it costs me, and that makes sense. I don't understand what church membership means. I mean, so so what is that, right? So they don't have this picture of what it's supposed to be. So then we changed the question. I said, well, do you feel like you belong to the church? Do you feel like you're part of it? And I said, oh, well, that's different, right? So we had one church, and you'll see this in the book. This one young adult said, so how did you know, when did you know you belonged? And he goes, well, I was going through my Slack channel, and I saw I got added to the Slack channel for the young adults group to help with coffee. And my name popped up. So I got added. And it was that moment I realized, wow, I'm part of this thing, because I got added to the Slack channel. Now, all the things I just said there, like I would talk to a 45-year-old pastor and they'd go, what is Slack?
Right.
What is that? Right. What are you talking about? Right. And so these markers of kind of what some of the ways that young adults in their places of work, their places of community, how they know they belong when they see their name pop up on a certain app, that they know that now been part of a list of things. They're on a text stream. They've now been grouped to the text stream of people. That's a trigger that's like, wow, I'm now part of this. Right. So belonging is a very different question for young adults than membership. Right. So I'm trying to shift the narrative around that. And even as I bring that up, I get churches really nervous about this, because the other thing about membership that young adults hear is, why do I have to be exclusively part of that as opposed to this? Right. So when I join a church, when I'm part of a church community, why do I have to be exclusively part of XYZ Methodist Church? Why can't I just be part of a lot of churches? I mean, I'm participating in this church, but sometimes I like to go to their once a week, Taizé service they host. Right. Can I go to that too? And there's this weird exclusivity that local congregations continue to perpetuate, that they need to be the one-stop shopping for everything, right? And so there's a sense of almost a sense of adultery that
Yeah.
it's like, if I'm part of other
Yeah.
things and I'm cheating on my church or something like that.
Right.
And there's like this guilt if I take like my kid to this youth group as opposed to this youth group. Right.
Yep.
And so I've
Yep.
even asked churches this question. I said, well, why do you need to even have a youth group? There's a perfectly good youth group that's theologically aligned with you that's one block
Right.
away. And they're funding it. They've got a youth pastor who's crushing it right now. He's loving on these kids. Send your kids down there. Stop trying to scrape together something there because you only have 3 families anyway. Why don't you start putting focus in areas that you really, I think God is shaping you as a church? And there's a sense of failure and shame in churches if they don't become the one-stop shopping for everything.
Right.
And the metaphor I use in the book is I said, the death of shopping malls in America, right?
Yeah.
We are a very different country now. We're a very different time in the 21st century, as opposed to everybody gathers in one place to do all their shopping in one location. I can show you shopping mall after shopping mall after shopping mall that are failing in America because it's not how people think and live anymore, and nor do they kind of view churches the same way. A church does not have to be everything for you. It can be a grounding place for you. And for 22 to 29-year-olds, there's a lot that a local church should provide, and they want to be part of it. But there's nothing wrong with them listening to a good podcast like this one, reading a book that's being somebody else, going to other churches to meet other needs that are funding their spiritual life. And this is something that's just really hard, I think, for a lot of pastors who've been trained to be attractional churches, meaning we need to build our numbers in this one location, as opposed to spreading the gospel and participating in a larger network.
Yeah, I got that. This reminds me of a conversation I had with Scott Thumma. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. Mm-hmm. Talked about this model going forward of young adults utilizing different various methods or, avenues, I guess, to connect spiritually. I'm also thinking like, again, if I'm understanding this model you're highlighting, it's really like backwards of the traditional church model, which has been behave, I think, believe, belong. Like when you join in membership, then once you join, you demonstrate that you believe the right things, and then when you've done those 2 things, then you'll belong, right? Yep.
And certainly, if you go back to the patristics, right? You go back to 1st century, 2nd century churches, and people love to have this romance with, the 1st century church did this, this, and this, right? And they have this romantic picture of what it was like. Yeah. It was as crazy and as diverse as it is today. It's not terribly different. There are a lot of different house churches, oikos in the Greek, right? These church collectives. And they all had very different on-ramps and off-ramps than we think they do, right? It wasn't as unified as we may think. But the 2 things that are really particular about the early church, if you want to model it. Number 1, membership took a long time, right? 3 to 4 years, right, to become a member. And part of it was they weren't proselytizing in the way that we did today. They would tell the story of the resurrected Jesus, the power to heal, the power to be part of your life. This kind of outpouring of the Holy Spirit that we experience in Acts. But what they also knew is that to be part of this community was probably a death sentence for you, right? The closer you aligned yourself to a church, the more likely the Roman Empire was going to kill you, right? So you're not trying to get people a death sentence. You want to say, okay, you're really serious about this. Is this really something you want? So it wasn't like kind of like, hey, stay away, we don't want to be here. But it's like, do you seriously, deeply understand what it means to be part of this community, to have this part of your life, to be part of your family? So it took a while for people to experience kind of this understanding of full inclusion, right? It was a long spectrum, much more Emmaus Road than Damascus Road, right? I think a lot of churches want you to have a Damascus Road. Hey, I've got it now. It's instantaneous, the flash of lightning. I'm in. Right. And it's much more Emmaus Road, and so, and it is for young adults today. They're Emmaus Road people, not Damascus Road people. They want long, winding roads of conversations, and they're going to be shocked as anybody that they showed up in the congregation. It'll just happen over time. So early churches, it took a long time to do that because of the cultural impact that's there. But secondly, and I think this is even more important, the goal was not to be part of the church. The goal was to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. That was the goal. Churches were training areas to get you out into the world to proclaim the gospel, right? And so membership was not so much about how do we get you in, it's how do we send you out, right? How do we prepare you to go to work? How do we prepare you to be a father or mother to your children? How do we prepare you to be a soldier, after the 3rd century when Christianity became involved, with the state after Constantine, right? So it was more about the tools to go out into the world. It was never about how do we brand you as XYZ church member. It was more about how do we send you out into this thing. And so as sending stations, which we have an entire chapter on that, young adults get that idea that churches are resource centers, to send you out into the world. And when churches prepare you for what does it mean to go work at Google? What does it mean for you to have 5 different gig jobs, which are exhausting you, but that's how you're making your world work? How do we talk to you about what it means to be single in this time of life? How do we help you find funding, right? I mean, I tell churches all the time, if you want just an instant influx of young adults, change your greeter board outside and say, we will help you get jobs. Then you have a lot of young
I'm
adults.
going to that church. I'm going to that church now.
I mean, churches are, here's the thing that young adults tell us all the time. They go that churches are one of the few places in their life where they have multi-generational relationships. Right. Because the nature of the world outside of it is so segmented by age that when they go to a church, they can actually have a relationship with an 80-year-old and a 5-year-old, right? And it's an amazing microcosm of the fullness of humanity, people loving each other across denominations, hopefully a very diverse group. But they also are people who hold unbelievable wisdom. So young adults really want mentorship on a lot of things in their life. And so if they opened up their phone and started kind of getting their contact list to help people make connections, I want to start my career, I want to kind of do these kind of things. And they were more open about that stuff and they stewarded those resources. Boy, young adults would thrive in a place like that. And now I'm getting way ahead of myself, but these are a lot of things that you'll see in your churches. Yeah.
Yeah. So much good stuff here coming to mind. Like I'm thinking of, obviously Ryan Burge has done a lot of work talking about churches. So, church and social capital.
Right.
I'm thinking also of, I'm thinking of your long on-ramps, and let's get to on-ramps here shortly, but I'm thinking like Priya Parker's talk, her book on gathering, right? The Art of Gathering.
Right. Yeah. Great book.
I think that's one of the things that churches don't get is they want to make those barriers lower. And correct me if I'm wrong here. Like my sense is like when we make the barriers a little higher, it's like, oh, this actually matters. This is important.
Oh, absolutely.
So let's talk about this in the context of on-ramps and off-ramps.
Yeah. So like one of the things that we found is that we asked, what attracts you to a church, and what kind of pushes you away from a church, right? That's what we mean by on-ramps and off-ramps, right? What are the ways in which you are attracted to a community? What is it you desire? So like the top off-ramp that we found in our study was that the Christians in a church community really cared about each other, right? So imagine you walk into a Sunday morning and you're in the narthex or wherever the church is kind of gathering to meet and greet people. And what you observe are a bunch of people who are sitting there looking at their phones, kind of their backs to each other. They're kind of scratching their head, wondering when's this all going to start. They're kind of looking at their watch. As soon as they walk out, you overhear the conversations they're having with their kids. Like the first thing that happens once they leave the church is, hey, we got to get you to the select basketball game. Have you already started your AP test stuff? Have you got that going? Right? Hey, I got to get over to Jim's because I got to get my tire changed. Right? All very important stuff. But you're totally distracted and you're not part of what this thing is happening right here. What if there was a different narrative that you saw when you walked into a church? What if I walked into a church and I saw people coming up and asking, hey, Cindy, how did that biopsy go? What's going on with that? Or, hey, Bill, I know you had your second round of interviews for that job. Is there anything more going on with that? I mean, if I'm hearing these whispers and conversations, that's a very different type of caring for one another that they're experiencing. Young adults sense like a spidey sense, like a Peter Parker spidey sense, if a church actually cares about each other or they don't, right? Yeah. If people are there just to kind of hang out, be blasted by the music that's in there and leave, and just to check a box that I showed up on Sunday and hoping something stuck, as opposed to I go there because the people I love are here. The people I care about are here. And I want to know more about who they are and what they're doing, right? So that's one of the biggest off-ramps that we saw. And now that's a hard one to kind of like instrumentalize, right? It's like, how do you teach people to care about each other, right? So we really challenge, and we've done a number of different projects, and we do consultancy with churches, right? We're available to churches to do this kind of work. We do design thinking seminars. We do transition leadership seminars for them. And we try to get them to think through, okay, what are you actually here for when you're 55 years old? What are you here in this church to actually do? What's your purpose for being here? And we try to get them to think it's not just merely about information dumping, like I need to hear the gospel, I want to get good Bible teaching, good stuff, right? Mm-hmm. But you also have to, do you care about these people, right? Are these people that if they're not there tomorrow, would you be heartbroken about it? Would you go to their funerals? Would you actually be at their kids' weddings? Would you be invited? Right. So there's different ways of caring that young adults really see. Right. So that's one thing that was a big on-ramp for us. Another big on-ramp was that they actually spoke and cared about things that mattered, meaning that there were questions of justice, questions of inequity, economic issues, these kind of hot button issues that populate their this other 6 days of their work. Right. I mean, when the country gets on fire after the death of George Floyd, when there's an absolute, death spiral in the stock market that affects whether my gig economy job is going to be there tomorrow or not. The fact that in major metropolitan cities, this could be in Denver, Seattle, Los Angeles, New York, where I can't afford to live anywhere, right? Because housing's gotten so out of control that they can't live together, right? They can't even find a place to live. These are very real questions, and who's talking about it? This is literally what keeps me up at night. And I think salvation is vitally important. Yeah, I think we need to fight evil spiritually. But at the same time, I need to know exactly what's going on politically and economically, and how is this church involved in those questions? And so that's another on-ramp. If I hear people talking about these, not in a politically polarized way, not in kind of like, let's go get the other side, right?
Right.
Like, we're right, they're wrong. But it's like, where are places where we're troubled by this stuff? And we're naming it, right? We're not afraid to name it, and acknowledge it in ourselves, acknowledge it in our own hearts, and acknowledge it with others. Sorry, those are some of the on-ramps. I mean, but I can go through the book and kind of list some other ones for you.
Yeah. Any other real big off-ramps?
Yeah. I mean, some of the off-ramps that we kind of see, and if you look in the middle part of the book, you'll see some of these as well, is looking at kind of the ways in which, number one, and probably the biggest one that we get from young adults is that young adults don't feel like they get to be part of leadership, or they're not included in decision making. That's a big off ramp. So when they look around the room, we talk about the difference between leadership development and leadership identification, and this comes from Leroy Barber's work with particularly urban young adults and BIPOC communities. Is that when churches tell you, okay, look, we want to develop you as a leader, we think you have a lot of potential here. What the signal for that usually means is you're too young, right? You need to wait your turn, get in line. I'm 68 years old. This is what I do now that I'm finally retired. This is my thing. So I get to do this until I'm gone. And when I'm gone, you get to have this, right? Right. And so I want you to kind of, if you're 26 years old, my picture for you usually is, wait for it, go help with the youth group, right? So that's what you get to do. You get to help with the youth group. Now that's great. I mean, youth group needs more leaders, more mentorship. That's really cool. But a lot of our young adults, particularly in urban centers, they're like dealing with multi-million-dollar budgets at Amazon, right? They're managing teams of 58 people internationally on major projects, right? These are smart, intelligent, highly educated, gritty individuals who, if you turn them loose in church leadership, are going to be amazing, right? And we're squandering those people by pushing them away from key leadership decisions. So another off-ramp is that the church is not transparent about their financials, right? That the church will not talk about money. I always joke about the fact that if you want to really kill a Sunday morning, you say, hey, we're going to do a meet and greet. I want everybody to stand up out of their pews, turn to your neighbors, say your name, and how much do you make annually per year? And it's like, it's crazy because churches will talk about their sexual sins. They'll talk about, maybe they'll talk about other things, but they will not talk about money at all. It's like an off-topic conversation. And it is behind the eyeballs in the brains of young adults every second of the day. The question of, how do I make it through today? How do we make it through the month? How's this going to work? All the pressures they're hearing out there. So why aren't we talking about it? Jesus talked a lot about money, way more about money than he talked about sexual preferences. So why are we not being biblical Christians and talking about money more? And young adults get it. They say, look, I want to hear more about the fact that you are making this level of cash, you're investing in these things morally and ethically. How do you put that together? And they just want to know. right? I mean, it's great that you're building a 5,000 square foot deck on your house. And I'm trying to figure out an apartment to live in, but I just want to know how we put this together, right? I just want to know, right? I want you to help
Right.
me understand that, right?
Yeah.
And young adults will make decisions on that. I mean, they are very open about money. They will tell you exactly what's going on with themselves financially. They're very close to it, so they're not scared of that topic. So that's another big off ramp as well.
Yeah, so much good stuff here I want to respond to, but let's do this because you mentioned the idea of leadership.
Yeah.
And one thing that really intrigued me from the book, I'm going to read from 113 here.
Yeah.
One aspect of diversity that seemed to make a difference in leadership was gender. From our observations, we noted a trend toward health and vitality when women were involved in young adult leadership. So talk more about leadership, diversity, and how that can build trust.
Yeah. One of the things that's vitally important, I think, for young adults, and you look at all the data, you look at Pew data, you look at U.S. Census data, you look at Gallup polling, you can go down the list of various polling, is that young adults, particularly in their late 20s right now, have a very different view of what inclusion and diversity looks like. And here's the thing, is that different ages will be triggered by the word diversity in different ways. Right.
Yeah.
So if you're at a certain age demographic, you hear the word diversity and you all of a sudden all the battle shield things go up, right? It's like, okay, this is like some crazy thing that's going to happen. They're talking about tearing down systems. They don't like XYZ types of people and they want to do this and that. And that's not what's going on when you're talking about young adults. It's not how do we tear down old systems and build new systems? What they're looking for is a picture of humanity that they themselves have grown up in, right? 20-year-olds have been raised in probably the most, ethically, economically, and culturally diverse time that humanity's ever seen. They're the most traveled generation that's ever been on the planet. They've been around the world. They've had instant access to ideas across the globe. They've been reading and thinking about ideas that are from very diverse parts of our world. Diversity is not a scary thing for them. Diversity is a way that we show the fullness of the kingdom of God. And so when it comes to gender in particular, a lot of church traditions still have an imbalance when it comes to how leadership is understood. They will make certain theological and biblical arguments for that. And I stand by traditions who want to make those arguments. I'm not here to kind of change that. But I will say that you're getting young adults who are coming in, they're asking the question, in my body, as I come into this room as a woman or as a man, why am I afforded certain things and not certain things based upon the body that I'm coming into? And I just want to know why. Because the rest of the world is not viewing me that way. They're viewing me at my competencies. They're viewing me at my education. Now there are glass ceilings and concrete floors all around in everything, right? We have biases that come bubbling up through different things, and people experience that at workplaces and other things like that. But why is the church, continuing in some of these areas, right? And so when you see young women who have got their MBA from Wharton being told that they're not afforded leadership capacity within a church, you have to scratch your head and you say, okay, what's the reason for this? So when you're talking about a younger generation, they're very used to being in diverse conversations, diverse communities, whether it's gender, racially, economically, politically. They want diverse conversations politically, and they're not afraid of it. They have no problems having friends who are in various different parts of the of the political spectrum. They can actually have better. We found, this is crazy. We found that 20-year-olds have more civil dialogue about politics than 70-year-olds.
Yeah.
It just, we found it over and over and over again. They're like, yeah, here's my friend. They're voting for this candidate. They're my friend. We work together. Yeah, we kind of talk about these ideas, but yeah, we still go play pickleball together. It's not like we don't play pickleball, right? And they don't understand why churches have become so polarized on many of these factors and why they have chose a way away from diversity. So, like, one of the things we say in the book that we found from young adults is diverse communities show them a bigger God. The more diverse voices, the more diverse inputs, God is that much bigger. Homogeneous communities show them a small God, an easily manageable God. And the question for churches is, do you want to be following a big God or a small God?
Yeah.
Homogeny is a
Yep.
small God and diversity is a big God. It's just that basic. And so whether you're looking at Acts 2, whether you're looking at the kind of movement of the epistles, I mean, and young adults know this in spades, right? They have diverse friendships, they have diverse communities. And if churches continue to be the most segregated place on a Sunday morning, it's going to be really hard for them to understand the way that this is a global gospel. This is a unifying force. This is the cosmic Christ that we encounter in the epistles, right? They have a hard time seeing it if it becomes that small.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks for bringing that up. So I want to stay on the theme of gender, but switch gears a little bit because I was just watching this video before we started recording.
Yeah.
From the Wall Street Journal on like the difference between young men and young women in their political beliefs. Obviously, as we're recording this, the DNC, I think, was their last night. Can't remember when this will air, but this will probably air before the election. So very much we're going to be going through these themes. Like there seems to be like, I'm kind of shocked at this difference between young men and young women. And like, I'm kind of lamenting like how so many young men are going hard right. Like, I don't know if you have any insights, like what that's about. And then how that's showing up in churches, like this big difference.
Yeah. And again, we can do 2 to 15 more podcasts on the question of masculinity in America right now. Both from a sociological as well as a theological background. Sociologically, a number of people have been really wrestling with the question of what is masculinity right now? What does it mean? What is maleness? How does it understood? And you'll see in certain church communities, they'll think it has to do more with what they would say would be the feminization of masculinity. There's a deep concern that men aren't men anymore. And so there's all these kind of tropes and stereotypes of what that means. And then what we call the markers of gender, right? How do you know somebody is this or that? How do you people would say present but usually it's what we call markers in sociology, right? So how do you present maleness? How do you present femaleness? How do you present gender identity? And kind of what's happening right now with men in particular is a confusion of what really constitutes what actually makes somebody a man. What is masculinity supposed to look like? So there are regressive markers that people will go back to. They think, well, men are biologically, have more, they have more muscle mass, so therefore they must be stronger. So there must be, and so they'll have all these kind of rational ways that we're created a certain way by virtue of our biological makeup. So therefore that necessitates certain actions that we present in certain ways. And that's part of what's going on right now is they're kind of trying to ground a sense of gender. And this is across the board, right? As women post World War I, World War II entered the workplace, as more and more women have become, college graduates. I mean, higher education right now, 55% of women getting undergraduate, 55% of all people getting undergraduate degrees in the United States are women, right? So there's a majority of women who are getting educated as opposed to men in higher education.
Right.
And so,
and the economic outcomes are similarly, right?
Yeah.
Similarly
and now
divided.
what we're seeing in the workplace itself, this is the first time that we've seen this in kind of particularly white collar jobs, is every tier from the C-suite, CEO, CFO, COOs, all the way down to middle managers, district managers, county managers, whether it's in business, whether it's in medicine, whether it's in engineering. Almost every tier of leadership in most corporations have a majority of women versus men right now.
Wow.
Right. So what's happened is that there's been this massive shift that's been building ever since World War II when women were going to work because men were at war, where women are in places of power, they're in places of leadership, they're more highly educated. And this is creating a threat to kind of gender identities around masculinity. And one of the biggest areas in particular that's shifted is that men traditionally view themselves as what we call the breadwinner, like they're supposed to earn more money than a woman is. And so that a balance in a relationship is a man takes care of that and a woman doesn't. Well, now women actually are earning more money than men. Across the board. And that's becoming this also really strange confusion of what men's identity is supposed to be. How am I in a relationship with a woman who makes more money than me? They happen to have a culturally important job, right? Maybe they're a physician and I'm a graphic designer, right? And so, how do I walk into a dinner party? How do I have a cocktail conversation? And so these are all identity markers that are being challenged. So what's happening politically then is this, and I think it is frankly very damaging that we're going to see probably in 10 to 20 years of how this plays out, is men in particular are being told to be angry as opposed to be productive. So this is so if I can't be productive, if I can't do these other things, at least I can be angry, right? And that's a totally acceptable experience of masculinity in certain sectors, because that means that I have strength, right? I can yell, I can stomp my feet, I can be fierce, right? And so anger,
have big guns.
So anger and force are kind of the last bastion of this is something I get to do. So if a woman is angry, she gets, she's not valued. She's considered to be out of her mind. She's not rational. But men get to be angry and rational at the same time, right? So there's all these different markers that are playing out. And I think politically you're seeing that more and more. And part of what's deep down inside of it, and I see this with young men all the time, is that young men are looking for mentors. They just want, they want someone to kind of show them what it is to be 40, 50, 70.
Yep.
They want to walk alongside these people and get a picture of what does it mean to work? What does it mean to care for a family? What does it mean to be loved and love in return? Young adults are not scared of emotions. They're not scared of sensitivity. And there's a lot of young men who are deeply, deeply ashamed of caring, of being loving people. They feel like they're not allowed to do that. They're supposed to be mad all the time. They're supposed to be violent all the time, and they don't want to be violent. The vast majority, again, we're talking in the middle of the bell curve, not these extreme edges, right? But the majority of young men, they want to care and love and be with friends, and they want to have joy. They want to be productive. They want to have their work valued. They want to be valued in society. They don't want to be mad and angry and blow things up. And also they also don't want to be indifferent and cold, right? I mean, they're human beings. I mean, they were created to love and be loved by God. So I do think it's a really interesting time. And I worry, and this is where the formative communities matter. And later in the book, I talk about, churches being communities of loving defiance. It's a phrase that I borrowed from Ron Sider. And I think there's a way that churches can be in loving defiance to these models, right? They can show a different form of gender, right? They can show a different way of not having to be so polarized. I find it fascinating, and here I'm going to take one short detour here biblically, but in Genesis 1, Genesis 2, the Ish and Isha, the man and the woman in the garden, they're cognates in Hebrew that are very close to one another, right? They're created together, they're serving in the garden together and all that. When we get to Genesis 3 with the fall, when we have the Adamah, the man becomes different distinctly from the woman, right? And so the fall creates a sense of antagonism. A man is a man because he's not a woman, as opposed to just being a man before God, right? And that shift is now the trajectory that God's trying to create for us. As opposed to being adversarial, that I know that I'm a man because I'm not feminine, or I know that I'm a woman because I'm not masculine. I mean, that is not a biblical model. That is a fall model. That's a sin model. And so I don't understand actually why churches continue to perpetuate identity as an adversarial construct, right? That I only know who I am by what I am not, as opposed to what I am. So I'm hoping that churches can find communities of loving defiance to say, this is who we are in God, right? This is who God wants us to be, right? Not adversarial, but they wants us to be moving our faces forward and forward to the loving and redemptive power of Christ, right? And that's a very different way. And young adults, when they see that in a church, they'll come thronging. They'll want to be part of that.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that point about loving defiance, because I was going to ask about that. Let's end with before we take a break, let's end with this part about mentorship, because I appreciate, I'm thinking about myself as a 40-something-year-old man. I'm still looking out for mentors older than me to, like you said, help me grow and become a better man. How can churches better foster relationships with young adults?
Yeah, one of the models that's been really big within corporate structures that we've tried to bring back into churches is the idea of reverse mentorship. A lot of corporations, when you on-ramp into a job in a company, you will be assigned a mentor. And usually, it'll come in the form of kind of apprenticing somebody into a particular job or area of responsibility. You walk alongside people who are your skip level manager or something like that. They'll help you kind of be formed into the career that you're going to be moving into. But reverse mentorship is that one of the responsibilities of a skip level manager is to learn from the person coming in. Tell me more about where you went to school. Tell me more about your background. How can I incorporate your gifts and talents into what we do here, right? I mean, good long-term employee and talent acquisition means that you're constantly bringing and changing the organization from the bottom up, right? New people are coming in, they're bringing new ideas, and you want new ideas, right? I mean, if I'm in a tech industry, for example, I want to know what's the latest thing happening, right? I don't want to kind of keep making slate and chalk. I want to know what's new. Reverse mentorship in churches means that we train older adults to say, hey, you know what? You're curious, aren't you? I mean, you want to know about new things. Here are some very basic ways to engage young adults to learn more about who they are, what they bring. Start telling me more about your background. Tell me more about where you came from. So be very curious, be open-hearted, be generous with your time. And you do not have to speak all the time, because one of the things, particularly with men who are older, they feel like, well, I've got this whole reservoir of knowledge. I just want to talk at you for a while. It's kind of like Ken in the Barbie movie. I'm now going to play guitar at you. It's this strange kind of thing about just kind of like pushing ideas at somebody that I've learned in my wisdom. And that's what I'm supposed to be doing. And that's not mentorship. Mentorship is walking a journey together, and then listening, being curious, allowing somebody to flourish, and understand that mentorship doesn't have to be alignment, meaning that you don't have to have two people who agree on everything to be mentors. Some of the best mentors that young adults will find are people who are different than them, because they're showing the diversity of ideas in the world. They're showing different inputs. So those are some things about mentorship that's really important. But a lot of it is that just like any age group, people are insecure about what they can have to give. I mean, I've talked to so many older adults who are 60s and 70s who have so much to offer, and they're scared. It's like, I don't understand what they talk about. I don't know what brat means. I don't know. I don't know what this stuff is being thrown around. I don't know what that is. So I don't want to, and you get so used to being in control, of understanding things, and having, what we call a beginner's mind, understanding what it means to be open to what somebody else can teach you, and be okay about asking and saying, I don't know that. You just said something. I don't know what that phrase is about. Can you tell me more about it? So we've actually done some training with older adults to get them more comfortable with that. And I think that's a good start.
Okay. I'm going to ask you one more question though. So forgive me I'm keeping you long here.
No, it's okay.
The old man get off my lawn in me is saying, where there are times in church where the older person clearly has more wisdom, experience, insights, appreciation of tradition. Where is that balance? Like, at what point does the older or more wisdomed, experienced person have to say, hey, I really appreciate your insights, but here, like, this is why we do it this way. And as somebody who takes lawn care seriously, I totally love that metaphor, by the way. So, but I totally get what you're saying. Churches have been around for 2,000 plus years. Many of these traditions, have been around for a while. We have, 3 to 4 generations of depth that you can have even in a local congregation in America, right? They have a story to tell. And Christianity has always been what we call a democracy of the dead. That's a G.K. Chesterton phrase, which is that we give our votes to the past as much as to the future, right? So this is the communion of saints in Hebrews 11 and 12. This is the gathering of the cloud of witnesses. So we sit in congregations, part of a much larger story than we're seeing here in the room. And that includes the past. So when the 7 ecumenical councils of the church are putting down kind of, this is how we live, these are the things we believe, this is how we read scripture, there's a reason that we go back to that and say, okay, look, we want to move the dial on this question. Culture's changing, culture's moving. How do we sit with that, with what's gone on in the past? And that means that sometimes things take a while to wrestle with, right? And that means sometimes I don't always get my way. And that also means that I sit with the past and I'm sticking with it. Like, for example, if you look at Protestant, moving into using English, in our liturgy, right? We're not doing the Latin Mass. We're actually using English or German or French. And we think about the Reformation.
people have this imagination about Luther, just like, going to the Diet of Worms, having this big argument, strutting out like a boss and saying, I'm going to go change everything. And that's going to be awesome. And it took time. It took a lot of wrestling and pain and suffering for people to make change. And so just simple things like what Bible you read as opposed to this translation versus that translation, that takes wrestling. It takes time. Mm-hmm. And so I think the old man on the lawn who's saying, look, I want, this is the way it's always been. This is the way we're going to do it. As opposed to being like a wall, be a window and say, okay, let's both look out a window together. What do we see out there? What is God calling us to? And you're going to have some battles, right? You're going to have battles with young adults who say, well, I think, this is how we should present, this way, and this is how we should talk this way. And these are the issues that we need to be centered forward. And the person sitting next to you looking out the window with that person, okay, let's look at that. But let me show you another part of the vantage out the window that I see. So let's look together at what's going on outside, right? Let's kind of bring some harmony to that. And that means that we all give up something. And that's the other question, is the church willing to give up something to move forward? If you look at Acts 15, the Council of Jerusalem, as Gentiles and Jews are coming together and they're trying to wrestle with the question of circumcision and whether Gentiles need to be circumcised. I mean, that's a great microcosm of how that conversation went down. Peter took people out. They went around. They looked at other house churches and others, wrestled with this question, and the church changed. They did something different. But in Acts 15, it's very clear that being led by the Holy Spirit meant that you have different groups coming together, and they both had to give up something to move the church forward, right? So that means that young adults don't get it always their way. They don't get everything, right? They have to give up something too, right? And that's what love is ultimately. In order for me to love somebody, I have to make space for them. I have to give something up for us to be close. And churches that model a capacity that we all give up something means that they'll move forward. That's hard. It's hard work. I mean, if you think it's easy work, you're not in a church very long. It's a hard work. Yeah. And the other part of it too is staying long enough to see the change happen. So like, for example, in the book, we talk about when young adults take over leadership, we've seen that older adults start leaving the church. They're just like, they're not talking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I really like it when they preach on Bonhoeffer. So I'm going to go to a church where they talk about Bonhoeffer, right? And Bonhoeffer's great. Don't get me wrong. Karl Barth, great. I mean, I get all that, right? But a lot of people formed in a post-World War II evangelical setting. They have their drop-down list of things they need to hear as far as theologically. If they don't hear that or they hear something different, they don't know what to do. And so we challenge older adults. Hey, stay longer. Don't jump ship to another option. Stay longer. Stay long enough to see where this is going to take you before you jump ship, right? And don't just. And so it's a commitment to leadership transition. And this is a whole nother conversation that we could have on leadership transitions we're having right now. Young adults need older adults to stay, to give them both the courage and the wisdom. And this is back to our conversation, wisdom of what it means to be a church for the long, long story.
Yeah. And similarly, I imagine young adults got to stick around, be patient.
Yep.
To stay with that.
Yeah. Well, and this is, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, finish your thought.
Well, no, I was just saying exactly what it means. And this is where, one of my friends who does work in New Zealand talks about the difference between, fences and watering holes. Is that, because of the way they do sheep in New Zealand, right? There's more sheep than humans, about 3-to-1 ratio, right? Of sheep to humans. And when you're herding sheep and you're kind of putting sheep and grazing them, there's too many to kind of have to try to contain them, right? So you don't, and fencing it off just doesn't work, right? So you just let them graze. So what you do is you create watering holes and salt licks, and they'll always gather in those places, right? So as opposed to kind of trying to fence people in with boundary lines, just create a very hospitable watering hole that you're going to keep coming back to, right?
Well,
and don't worry, because they will come to the watering hole. They're going to be thirsty. And if it's water that's pure and good, and they're going to get what they need. So don't get too stressed about locking the door. Don't worry about kind of trying to contain people. Just build a really hospitable space. And who God brings, right? And let that be your witness to the world, because the world needs good water. It doesn't need more fences.
Yeah, that's a good metaphor. The book is Defiant Hope, Active Love, What Young Adults Are Seeking in Places of Work, Faith and Community. Jeff is the editor of this, so really encourage folks to check it out. I really appreciate reading it. Jeff, really appreciate the conversation. We've been long, so thanks for your time. Let's take a quick break and come back with some closing questions.
Great, thanks.
All right, we're back with Dr. Jeff Keuss. So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate the conversation. Like you said, I've got a page full of notes here. We could have, like you said, had multiple podcast conversations on these topics here. So I hope this is helpful for listeners. And again, if you're looking to dive in deeper, go check out the book. Want to recommend it. So some closing questions. Always encourage folks, you can take these as seriously or not as you'd like to. Mm-hmm. If you're Pope for a day, what's that day look like for you?
If I was Pope for a day, the Bishop of Rome. What a job description. Yeah, I think if I was Pope for a day, I think there'd be kind of three basic things. And part of it is there's a novel written in the 1970s called The Shoes of the Fisherman, which was about a new an enclave was getting together to call a new pope. New pope was given. And it was it's this kind of fable, but it's the beginning of World War III is about ready to break out because people are starving in Central America, right? So very interesting story. And they're trying to figure out how to stop World War III, and the world powers turn to the Pope. And he goes and reflects, and he's thinking and praying. At the very end of the book, spoiler alert, but it's been out since the 70s, so I don't feel bad about spoiling this for you. But in the end of the book, the Pope says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to divest all of the holdings of the church to feed the world. I'm going to sell all the art. I'm going to sell all the property. I'm just going to give it all away because the church has always been about faith, and these holdings are needed, and I'm giving it all away. And if the church is here after it's done, then God is blessing it. And I think there would be a level of radical deinvestment of power that I'd see. I think particularly as you look at the way in which the American Catholic Church has created struggle points between bishops in Africa and other things like that. There needs to be a radical realignment in Rome from my perspective. And I'm saying this as a Protestant. So I don't have, so I'm outside of it. But if I was Pope for a day, I would definitely look at how do we realign ourselves to a more simple and more economically realistic picture of what the church is supposed to be. So I probably wouldn't be very popular that day, but I do think it would be an interesting conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
Well, I definitely one of my go-to in the patristics is St. Augustine of Hippo. I've learned a lot from Augustine. When he was bishop, as a rhetorician, as a writer, he has been so impactful in my life. I would love to talk to him about the first 10 books of Confessions. The first 10 books are his autobiography as being this wild kid, running around doing kind of crazy stuff, fathering an illegitimate child, getting mixed up with the wrong people, has this radical conversion to faith. And he moves into becoming this, one of the greatest theologians we've ever experienced. And I would love to sit down at a table with him and say, tell me more about this conversion, about this call of God to take up and read Scripture, and the way that you conceptualize, the Trinity. And as an African, what could you say to us today, as far as how we listen to voices on the African continent to help us be better understanding the global impact of Christ. I think Augustine is so contemporary right now, and that would be an amazing conversation. And I think he'd be pretty mad at me for bringing him back to life because I think he's having a great time in glory. So I think I'd have to spend the first 15 minutes apologizing.
Yeah. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
I think if I was to get my DeLorean and go into the future, to name a certain movie from the 80s, I think I think we look back on this period of time and two things would be very apparent. One is that this is one of the most exciting technological eras that humanity's ever experienced. I think they're going to see, what the acceleration of technological and medical advances in this period of time. What it kind of did. I mean, it's going to be this age of almost singularity of change it's occurred. The second thing is going to be looking back and with a sense of such sorrow of we could have done so much more ecologically. Why didn't they understand the data? Why didn't they do something differently about what's going on environmentally? I think politically, there's going to be a sense of looking back on this in the history books and thinking, They had so many things in common. Why didn't they work together? Why were they had everything at their fingertips. And so I do think there'll be some of that dissonance. There'll be this kind of, age of wonders of seeing kind of where we're going to go. Technologically began with so many things that happened in the 21st century. But I also think there's going to be such a sense of sorrow of like, you had so many things together and look, I don't want to get apocalyptic, but I do think there's a reckoning that's going to happen with our division that'll be just really traumatizing.
Sure. What do you hope for the future of Christianity?
One of the things I love about following Jesus, one of the things I love about doing the work I get to do and talking about God and kind of being in communities that talk about faith is it's a topic that'll never get exhausted. Everybody keeps announcing the death of God, right? It's like, oh, it's over. The church is folding. That you get all this wah, 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 we're going to, you get all this stuff and it's been going on and on and on. One of the things about the history of the faith is you get to see that conversation over and over again. You realize everybody keeps announcing the death of the church, right? And God's not done yet, right? God's done when God's done. Right. So I get thrilled. The two things I'm excited about. One is I think we're finally getting beyond the Eurocentric view of Christianity, that there's a prioritization of the European voice around the faith. Is that there's a moving forward of so many theologians globally, from the global South, from the African continent, that are bringing voices and evangelizing. And I mean, we're getting evangelists who are coming to the Pacific Northwest from Ghana, from Malawi, who are knocking on doors and saying, we want to tell you about Jesus Christ. We're excited to tell you what God is doing, right? And the Spirit is moving, and you're getting these Pentecostal revivals, and you get this growth of the church happening in the global South. And I'm thrilled with what God was doing with that, right? And so I'm not optimistic. I'm hopeful, right? Because I think hope is a different thing than optimism, right? I mean, hope is an actual theological virtue, that we need to talk about more. And so I'm very hopeful about the future of the faith. I want to see what God is doing and showing up. And this work that I've been doing with young adults has also shown me that God is in good hands with the next generation. I am not in any way, shape, or form feeling like, oh no, they're going to drop the ball and they're going to walk away from God. That's just not going to happen. God is waking hearts of, 20-year-olds, and they're getting fired up, and they're going to do church way differently than I did. And I couldn't be happier about that.
Yeah. Well, great stuff here. Really appreciate the conversation. Share, if you would, just how can people connect with you, whether to get the book or whatever.
Yeah. So, you can find me on social media. So Jeff Keuss, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. Just go and connect with me. If you type in my last name, there's very few people who have it, so you'll find me pretty quick. Also, you can contact me at the university, at Seattle Pacific University. You'll find me there in the Faculty of Theology. And also the book is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the sites you're looking for. And also just DM me or email me. And if you have questions, if you pick up the book, I'm more than happy to dialogue with your church leaders. I'm very good at Zoom and happy to Zoom in with you to talk more about the book. Our team of researchers would love to talk to you too. Because we're funded by the Lilly Endowment, it won't cost you much at all to have a consultation with us about maybe challenges you're having. We do this all the time. We'd love to help your church kind of think through these big ideas to kind of serve God better.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate the time. Always leave folks with a word of peace. So may God's peace be with you.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Loren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.